Thanks for tuning into the Conscious Hour. If you ever wondered where we're headed, well, this is the most precise analysis of where we're headed, and I want you to pay close attention because it describes everything that's happening geopolitically around the world, and you will not see this on mainstream news. So stay tuned to the Conscious Hour. Here we go.
It's fighting in against Lebanon as well as Iran. The Iranians, they don't have much of an air force, but they use a lot of drones to threaten. So this is where we are so far. According to the grand strategy, we can predict how they will make their moves over the next few months, over the next few years. America doesn't really care about this war in Iran because what America wants to do is force the entire world to become dependent on American weapons and resources. And you do that in two ways. The first is you control the strategic choke points of the world. And they include the Strait of Hormuz. But you also want to control the Strait of Malacca, or over here, because that blocks off East Asia. You also want to control the Panama Canal. You also want to control Greenland. You also want to control the Strait of Gibraltar. You can see the American Navy expanding outwards and occupying all these maritime choke points. At the same time, you want to use your technological supremacy, your aerial supremacy, your drones, to destroy the world's critical energy infrastructure. Already we're seeing oil refineries being destroyed throughout the world.
Oil refineries.
Oil refineries, yes. Yeah. So you, as America, you're trying to deplete the world's energy inventory, so they're forced to beg you to supply energy, right? And once this market is created, then you can build infrastructure for Venezuela. You can take over Canada. You can control Mexico. You can take over Greenland, okay? The Russians have no choice but to respond, because if the Americans are controlling the strategic choke points, your shadow fleet is rendered redundant, useless. So how do you ship your oil around the world? Well, you have two options. I'm just going to build railways to unite the Eurasian continent, okay? And I'll transport my oil using pipelines and railways. The problem with that is not that you're vulnerable to American aerial supremacy, drone attacks. So you have no choice but to arm your shuttle fleet. And now what's going to happen is this conflict in the oceans between Russian shuttle fleet tankers that are trying to transport oil around the world and these American destroyers who are trying to capture or destroy these shuttle tankers. Now, the advantage that Russia has is that America doesn't have that much naval assets anymore. It used to, but not anymore. The other thing is that the world really needs energy, so you can imagine China financing the militarization of the Russian shuttle fleet.
Why would the US try and stop Russian boats?
Because in this global outlook, there are two nations that could provide weapons and resources to the rest of the world. Mm-hmm. They are Russia and they are America. So if America has become dominant, it needs to blockade Russia. And way you do that is by seizing their shuttle fleet.
But if that happened, that would be an act of war.
But it's already happening.
What, really?
Yes, it's already happening.
Where?
Iranian tankers have been seized by the Americans, and tankers are being seized in the Caribbean as well by the American Navy.
Whose tankers?
I believe they are Russian tankers.
Yes, the United States has indeed been seizing tankers linked to Russia. A major escalation occurred earlier this year on January the 7th, 2026, when the US military and Coast Guard intercepted two sanctioned Shadow Fleet oil tankers. While one was seized directly in the Caribbean, the other involved a dramatic chase that started in the Caribbean and ended in the North Atlantic. US forces captured this sanctioned tanker during a pre-dawn raid directly in the Caribbean Sea. The US military described it as stateless sanctioned dark fleet vessel, which was engaged in illicit activities. These seizures are part of Operation Southern Spear, a strict enforcement of the US embargo on Venezuelan oil exports. Both vessels were targeted for violating US sanctions by transporting illicit crude oil linked to Venezuela, as well as Iran and Hezbollah.
And as you point out, this is an act of war.
So those were ships that didn't have a country linked to them directly.
That's why they're called shadow fleet tankers.
Okay.
Yes. But they're essentially Russian.
But they were essentially shipping oil outside of the United States that the United States wouldn't control. Is that kind of...
That is correct, yes.
Okay.
Yes. So
the US said, listen, this is our oil, get lost.
That is correct, yes. Right? So what the United States is doing is slowly expanding its global reach. And way it's doing that is by signing treaties with nations that are part of these choke points. So the Strait of Malacca, recently the United States has signed a military cooperation agreement with Indonesia. And with the Strait of Gibraltar, the Americans have signed an agreement now with Morocco, right? So they're looking for the legal framework, justification to control the world's choke points, which would bring them directly in conflict with the Russian shadow fleet.
So at some point, you think the way that the war starts is the US Navy attacks a Russian boat?
So I personally believe that this will be a drawn-out process and there's no real concrete flashpoint. Because not only are Russian shadow fleet tankers being seized, but remember, Russian oil refineries are being destroyed by Ukrainian drones. And the Russians believe that it is NATO that is responsible for the sabotage.
So what do you think the catalyst moment is when this all kicks off?
I think we're already in the catalyst moment. I think we're already in World War III because this conflict, it's going to expand outwards into a global conflict, and there's nothing anyone can do to stop this, right? Because again, you have these different competing visions of how the world should work, and the Russians and Americans are already at conflict with each other. So the next step will be the Russians come into this war on the side of the Iranians.
Do you think that's going to happen?
I think that's going to happen because according to Russian grand strategy, you have no choice but to save the Iranians because you're trying to promote this view that the world is split between the spiritual and the material. The Americans are the Antichrist. The Americans support individual hedonism, whereas we Russians, we believe in humanity. We believe in goodness. We believe in community, right? So if that is your argument, if that's your grand strategy, then you have a more obligation, a more imperative to help the Iranians in their time of need. And in fact, Prime Minister Arachi of Iran has recently visited Putin in Moscow. Putin personally received him and said to Arachi, we, the Russian people, admire your determination, your resolve against the Americans. And I think that is a sign that Putin has entered the chat and that the Russians will start to help Iranians as this war progresses. So let's go back to this map, okay?
Okay.
And the Americans have a three-pronged strategy to strangle Iran. The first is to use ground forces to establish port operating bases to incite ethnic violence in the country. The second is to block all the Strait of Hormuz and cut off Iranian financing. The third is to strangle Tehran and cause the people to rise up against the government, okay? If the Russians, so if things stay as they are now, America wins easily. But if Russia were to enter the war on behalf of the Iranians, the first thing that Russia would do is provide Tehran with reinforcement from the Caspian Sea, right? Because the Americans want to knock out Tehran's capacity to provide food, water, and electricity to its people. But through the Caspian Sea, the Russians can support the Iranians. But not only that, and this is much more important, if the Russians were to come in, they could also bring the Chinese into the war on behalf of the Iranians. And the Chinese could use the Belt and Road Initiative, basically the railway system, to reinforce Tehran from the east. So now you can no longer strangle Tehran because the Russians and the Chinese are reinforcing Tehran. Then what the Russians could do is provide financing to the Iranians. Basically,
So what you have is World War III or Armageddon. We're on our way, folks, and it ain't gonna stop. This is the Conscious Hour. Do me a favor, please donate, would you please? I've spent almost 4 years doing this. Thanks for tuning into the Conscious Hour. Please hit the like and share.